welcoming everybody as they come in to this first panel event being organised by the Centre for Workforce Futures. My name is Lucy Taksa. I'm the co-director with Daryll of the centre, which is located in the Macquarie Business School at Macquarie University. And we're really very happy to welcome everybody to this first panel webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on industrial relations and working futures, focusing today particularly on the changed rules on enterprise agreements. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I'm meeting, the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation, and Macquarie University's land, the Wadamadigal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture the land since Dreamtime. Together with you on all the different lands on which you are on today, we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all the ancestors, and to the land and the water and its knowledges, dreaming and cultures embodied within and throughout our whole country. And we particularly acknowledge the difficult times that are occurring not only in Australia, but internationally at this time. So the Centre for Workforce Futures is what we call a collaborative hub, a collaborative and cross-disciplinary hub whose members draw on past and present knowledge and undertake holistic research and hopefully thought leadership with partners in government, industry and the not-for-profit sector to address current and future economic, social and policy challenges relating to the organisation of work, working people, work organisations and employment. As a collaborative hub, we welcome associate members from other organisations and other universities. And we do so with the aim to promote decent work, the achievement of decent work as defined by the United Nations and the International Labour Organisation. And the slide in front of you outlines our vision, our mission and our objectives, which is to ensure decent work for all. So today we're really, really happy to welcome three speakers in particular. We've selected them to develop a sort of a macro view leading down to the front lines and the grassroots. So we welcome our own Professor Louise Thornthwaite, who's in the Department of Management at Macquarie University and also our Deputy Director, who will introduce the critical issues from an academic perspective. Then we'll move on to the Honourable Adam Searle, MLC, who is no stranger to industrial relations, and I'll introduce him in due course with all his activities. And of course, Mark Morey, Secretary of Unions New South Wales, for the frontline grassroots perspective. Daryll and I, as co-directors, will be facilitating the event, but we also are very grateful for our technical assistance. We have Billy Bruce there, who's not showing you his face. He's in the Blue Mountains and well rugged up for the day. If you have any technical needs, then please email him at billy.bruce@mq.edu.au. We're also very pleased to have help from Pabs Delgado Hernandez, who's organising not only the recording, but making that recording accessible to all participants today. Those who've registered will get access to that recording in due course after Pabs has done his work. So basically, Daryll and I will be doing the facilitation I'm going to be introducing each speaker in turn. They'll speak for 10 minutes, and hopefully I won't have to channel Frederick Winslow Taylor too closely today. They all have watches on them. And then I'll open with a leading question while Daryll collects up the questions that you yourselves can add through the Q&A button. So just tap the button, you can type your question, and Daryll will be collecting those and gathering them together, hopefully covering as many as possible. And we look forward to a less than formal engagement. I'm sure you've all been to webinars that are highly formalised. We hope that ours, after the presentations, will enable engagement, more informal engagement. So now let me introduce Louise Thornthwaite. Louise has published widely on industrial relations regulation and policy, social media at work, supply chain regulation, particularly in occupational health and safety, in the transport sector, employer association strategy, and the impacts of law and policy on management practice. So welcome, Louise, and I'm going to stop the share and focus on you. Thank you. Unmute.
To begin, among the dizzying array of federal government announcements on the industrial relations front in the early stages of COVID lockdown was the amendment on the 17th of April 2020 of the Fair Work regulations to insert a new regulation which altered what is called the access period for varying an enterprise agreement. Under the Fair Work Act, before an agreement can be varied, an employer must take all reasonable steps to ensure that relevant employees have copies of the agreement and access to relevant information about it. The government's amendment reduced the time that employers were required to provide this access to employees over proposed variations from a minimum of 7 days to 1 day or 24 hours. This 24-hour notification period currently applies to all employers and employees covered by the Fair Work Act. Now, the federal government changed the regulations to make it quicker and easier for employers to vary already agreed wages and conditions. And for employers, the amendment created possibilities for changing wages and conditions in existing agreements in a variety of ways. Some of those that Ines Willocks of the Australian Industry Group suggested were delaying or cancelling future wage increases, giving employers the right to direct employees to take annual leave, facilitating changes to working hours and locations, and changes to rostering arrangements. And anecdotally, since then, there have been substantial indications that employers have made some of those changes to which Willocks referred. The amendment was to apply for 6 months. However, any variation of wages and conditions made under it will continue to operate indefinitely unless the variation included a specified time limit. And when I say indefinitely, that is until the agreement is varied, replaced, or terminated, which could be up to 4 years. As well, the 6-month period in which this regulatory change operates could be extended by the government. Now, while the amendment appeared suddenly, it's important to note that changes to regulations do not need to be approved by Parliament, but there were attempts to have the regulation disallowed in Parliament, and these failed. However, following expressions of concern by unions and opposition parties, the Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations, Mr. Christian Porter, agreed to a review of the workings of the regulation in June, which is now upon us. The amendment raises a number of crucial issues for industrial relations in Australia. Some of these issues concern simple questions of timing. How much time do people need to absorb proposals for major change to their wages and working conditions? The amendment suggests that 7 days access to a proposed variation is too long in fast-changing times or in a crisis. It suggests that 1 day access is sufficient in such times, and by implication that genuine agreement can be gained in 24 hours. It is a nonsense, of course, to assert that employees can make an informed decision about something as complex as an enterprise agreement in 24 hours. Nonetheless, this has set a precedent for the position that in certain situations it is impracticable and also unnecessary for employers to have to engage in dialogue and to negotiate wages and conditions. That is, that enabling virtually unfettered managerial prerogative is okay in a crisis. In terms of encouraging unfettered managerial prerogative, the change reflects the view that Steve Knott, the CEO of the Australian Mines and Minerals Association, recently expressed when he said that now is the time to put faith in employers to do whatever is in their power. It's not just the lack of time that is of concern here, it's the type of protection that the Fair Work Commission can provide that is also problematic. The Commission still has a role approving variations to agreements. There are three elements the Commission must consider, and I'll state them in reverse order here. That the variation does not reduce the NES standards, National Employment Standards, but the boot test still applies, and that is that agreements must still result in employees being better off than under the relevant award. And thirdly, that the parties must have genuine agreement. But in terms of the boot test, that second point, it's important to note two things. For many employees, the wages and conditions in agreements are often considerably above that in the underlying award. That is, the award is very much superseded and hence not really comparable. And secondly, the Commission has and has always had a discretion to approve an agreement even when concerned about it, and to approve it in exceptional circumstances so long as it is not against the public interest. Therefore, the boot test provides limited protection. Now, as I said before, the Fair Work Commission must also be satisfied that there has been genuine agreement or variation. The question is, when an employer gives employees a document and asks them in a context of fear and crisis to agree to it the next day, what does genuinely agreed mean? And here it is crucial to note that the genuine agreement provisions in the Fair Work Act do not bear any relationship to what we might intuitively think of as informed consent or actual agreement. In the Act, genuine agreement refers to certain processes an employer must comply with. That is, the employer must give employees a copy of the proposed variation and relevant materials to understand it. The employer must explain the terms and effect of the provisions to employees, and the employer must advise them of how and when to vote on it. So this is about affording a process only, and the process mentions nothing about the undue pressure, coercion or duress applied in a climate of uncertainty and fear. It mentions nothing about ensuring that employees have representation or that they have any access to informed consultation. Nor do any principles of good faith apply in this context, such as the good faith bargaining principle captured in section 228 of the Act. There is no requirement for a business to recognise the employee's bargaining representatives and to discuss the variation with them. There's no requirement for a business to disclose commercial information. An employer does not have to show they've suffered a serious downturn. And indeed, all employers covered by the Fair Work Act can take advantage of this stripped-back context of agreement making, regardless of adverse economic circumstances having affected them. However, what the changes signify may nonetheless have longer-term impacts that we have not yet anticipated. In industrial relations theory, and we distinguish the unitarist and pluralist approaches to industrial relations. Now, the unitarist position upholds the sanctity of management prerogative, the right of employers to manage without external intervention or oversight. The regulatory change we are discussing reflects the unitarist position in asserting that there are contexts in which not only negotiation, but even consultation must be dispensed with altogether. This is not a new demand from Australian employers. Worth noting is that also in late April, the Australian Mines and Minerals Council again called for the suspension of all awards and agreements for 6 months to help employers make necessary changes during the crisis. By comparison, the regulation reducing the time to consider changes to variations is somewhat mild. However, in coming to an end, I'd like to say that the unitarist conception underpinning the regulatory change to make variations to agreements sits in stark juxtaposition to the emerging narrative at federal level of a pluralist pluralist collaboration, and accord to help reshape Australian industrial relations post-COVID, a tripartite spirit of cooperation. So looking at these together, the regulatory change and the new narrative reflect considerable cognitive dissonance. They are quite simply philosophical worlds apart. Finally, in the context of those current discussions at federal level on industrial relations, there are three suggestions I would propose. The first is that the process for varying agreements must guarantee that parties have sufficient time for consultation and for real acceptance, which should be at least 7 days. That as an article of good faith, employers should be required to provide financial transparency in relation to the negotiation of agreements and their variations. And finally, that in making public policy, the federal government needs to acknowledge that in the pluralist democratic society that is Australia, managerial prerogative is and must be fettered by requirements for collective negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. I'm sure everybody's applauding in their own lounge rooms or kitchens, wherever they are. I certainly appreciated that overview, and also particularly the last points around the competing narratives, which I think we really do need to keep in mind because lots of things slip through when there's these conflicts and the narrative, one narrative dominates and the reality is something else altogether. So this brings us to our second speaker. Welcome to the Honourable Adam Searle. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you, Adam. Adam has been an Australian Labor Party member of the New South Wales Legislative Council since May 2011. Following years working for the Attorney General and Minister for Industrial Relations, Jeff Shaw, from 1995 to 2000, working on the industrial legislation of the day then. And while he was a barrister, he was involved in a number of leading cases, including the pay equity case for childcare workers, and also, very importantly and relevant for us today, the investigations of the law relating to workplace deaths, which is an ongoing struggle. So welcome, Adam. Thank you for your time, and we'll look forward to hearing your perspectives on the regulatory context. Thanks.
Look, thanks, Lucy. And look, I just wanted to say I agree with everything that Louise has said, but it is timely to remind ourselves that while all of those things are very important, most workplaces in New South Wales and around the country are relatively small. Most of the workplaces have, 20, 30, 40, 50 people, sometimes much less. The employers aren't particularly sophisticated. A lot of workplaces don't have any active unions in them. And so a lot of the regulatory changes, while important, a lot of those workplaces are just ignorant of them anyway. And so in the COVID crisis, a lot of those things I think are exacerbated. It's timely to remind ourselves that in April alone, New South Wales lost 221,000 jobs. And I'm told that around about, nationwide, the job losses have been much greater, and 55% of those who have lost their jobs are women. In New South Wales, I'm told that's a bit higher. So that's a huge disproportionate gendered effect of the loss of employment. And New South Wales has had the biggest slump in private demand anywhere in the nation. So we're leading the country into recession, possibly worse. And of course, we can see from what Louise has said, the reaction from governments, conservative governments and employers is always to attack working conditions and attack pay. The federal public services had their wages, they say frozen, we would say cut. And in New South Wales, the state government again tried to cut the wages of 410,000 of its workers. They tried to do that using a legislative mechanism they had at their disposal in the form of a regulation. The upper house, where I sit, Labor led the charge to have that regulation disallowed, which was successful. But the government is now in the Industrial Relations Commission trying to persuade the commission to do its dirty work and to, they say freeze wages, but when that just fails to take into effect the fact that inflation continues to erode purchasing power, and obviously if you can buy less tomorrow than you could today, when you multiply that across 410,000 workers, that's again exacerbating a reduction in private demand, and that means businesses take a hit all across the state, and of course that affects employment as well. The statistics are pretty alarming. There's nearly 30% of hours have been lost in terms of work. 12% of people are being put on paid leave. Nearly 10% of people apparently are being put on unpaid leave. So there is enormous pressure on workplaces. Unemployment might be officially at 6%, but that's artificially down because of JobKeeper. Underemployment's nearly 14%, and for women again, it's much, much higher. There's a very timely article in the Herald today by Ray Cooper and one of her postdoctoral students, and you can see the gendered effect of the sort of loss of employment and the pandemic, and you can see this all around the Western world. People who do have work, however, are working much longer hours. Men are working 30 to 40% of men in employment are working longer hours, and for women it's anywhere between 10 and 40%, because whether it's because the employers are expecting more or because people are at home and not commuting, there has been a big uptick, particularly as I've detected in the public sector here in New South Wales, of people just working longer and longer hours. And that's a real issue when you see people losing hours and losing their jobs entirely, and then on the other hand, those who have work sort of being sweated. And of course, employers for years have resisted working from home and have put up real barriers because, in a sense, they don't trust their employees, or they actually don't know how to determine whether the work they need is actually being performed, because in my experience, a lot of employers don't really know what their staff do, and it's very hard for them to manage outcomes. But ironically, one of the effects of this lockdown and people working from home, to a much greater degree, is employers can see that it works, and it's working so well that employers are now, I think in many cases, reluctant for people to return to the workplace. In the public sector here in New South Wales, there's a real drive to reduce accommodation costs. So only about 70% of the public service on any one day can actually physically go to work. The public sector in New South Wales now needs at least 30% of its staff to not turn up on any one day, just to make sure everyone has somewhere to work. And you can see private sector employers now starting to look at this, now that they can see that working from home can be quite effective for them. And you can also see, while people are getting a time dividend not having to commute, women are doing more unpaid work in the home, and also people not having access to all the informal mentoring and other beneficial social aspects of work. And particularly if you're new to a workplace and you don't know everybody else and you're not part of existing networks, I think only being able to sort of virtually participate through mediums like this is really going to have a very negative impact on egalitarianism at work and people having proper access to things like promotional opportunities, because they're not in the loop, they don't know people as much, and they don't have access to those informal power structures. I mean, every workplace will have a formal structure, and there'll be informal structures based on relationships, and working from home permanently really attacks and undermines that. And so I think some of the outcomes of this is that employers will want people to work from home much more, in some cases permanently. Workers will like working from home, but they will be fighting to have access to get back into workplaces where they can have access to the beneficial and social aspects of work. This also raises the question about working from home is not being properly regulated or equipped. It used to be done sort of ad hoc. You can work from home a day or two here and there, or even on a regular rostered basis, but that, there was no OH&S assessment. You didn't necessarily have the right equipment. I mean, my partner who works in the Federal Public Service, she was made to work from home, but was given no equipment. We had to go out and buy all our own equipment. But that's fine, we could do that, but not everybody can. So if work from home is going to become done on a much bigger mass scale, it needs to be regulated, it needs to be equipped. And of course, with employers, I think they will have this drive to reduce their rental and accommodation costs. There's been articles in the paper about rental accommodation for businesses in CBDs, Parramatta, Sydney, Melbourne, North Sydney, those prices crashing because now employers are thinking, well, we don't need to house 100% of our staff at work. We can maybe have much less sort of office space. And so I think that's going to be another struggle. So what are the solutions here? Of course, the state's ability to regulate the world of work outside the public sector has been compromised by the Fair Work Act and, of course, the Workplace Relations Act before it. But the state still has power over work health and safety laws and regulation. And I think health and safety at work, both in terms of regulating work hours and making sure that when people work, particularly outside of the regular workplace, there is proper health and safety regimes put in place. Anti-discrimination laws are still state-based and the states can still legislate with respect to that. So looking at the gendered and inequality that arises from things like the pandemic, I think the states have the legal ability to legislate or have other mechanisms under that head of power to deal with that. And we'll need to do some more of that if we are to address the inequality that we're seeing emerge even more greatly than before in our workplaces. So that's not so much a set of solutions, but a sort of set of phenomena that I've observed in both the public and private sector, and some of the mechanisms that I think the state government and certainly the State Labor Party will be looking at to try and address the outcomes of the impacts of the pandemic and its impact on the world of work.
Thank you, Adam. It's an issue that the working from home is has all sorts of benefits, but the costs, I'm wondering who's paying for the electricity and so on. It's an issue that the employers are benefiting from this inordinately, I think.
Well, there's also the internet. Like, I live in the Blue Mountains. My house has really crap internet. Often seminars like this, it gets very scratchy and I have to move around the house. Again, if you're performing work on deadline and your system isn't effective, that's going to have a real impact on people's ability to work. The digital divide across New South Wales and Australia is catastrophic in this respect.
Yeah, so there's inequity issues there as well. And that takes us right down to the front lines and the grassroots. And thanks, Adam. We're going to, last but not least, hear from Mark Morey, who really is on the front lines. He's been the Secretary of Unions New South Wales since February 2016. Before that, he was Assistant Secretary. And he was also the Executive Officer at the Rail, Tram and Bus Union New South Wales branch between 2005 and 2008. So he's been personally on the front lines and previous to that in the public sector employee. So I'm sure he's very happy with the minor victory that we'll have to deal with soon in terms of public sector pay and jobs. Mark, thank you. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Lucy. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I think the changing nature of work, particularly post-COVID, is very much about the seen and the unseen. I think with JobKeeper, it's certainly done a reasonable job in keeping people employed. For us, we were pushing certainly for a system very much like the United Kingdom, where there was an 80% guarantee of a worker's wages or salary. We didn't get that. We got $1,500 a fortnight. And while that's gone some way, I don't think it's gone far enough. Particularly, as I say, the unseen part of that is you've got over 1 million people who are on some form of visa, temporary working student visa, who have been participating in the economy, paying taxes, and were unable to access JobKeeper. And I think I've heard stories very much about the E period at the moment, where part of that is about charity. And so a lot of those workers who are now unable to access JobKeeper, have been relying on food parcels, struggling paying rent, very significant effects on them, relying on food and charity at the moment, but no access to any sort of formal support. The other part of that for many of those workers is that as part of their visa conditions, they have to have private health insurance. And so with the massive loss of their ability to work at the moment, they're actually technically in breach of their visas because they can't rely on Medicare. They don't have private health insurance. The government's gone some way putting in moratoriums on that so that people are able to stay. But there's at least 1 million people, and many of those weren't able to return home, weren't able to leave the country when COVID hit, and so are in pretty dire situations. I think the other part is 1 million people who are in part-time casual employment, who are unable to, if you're in casual employment for less than 12 months, weren't able to access JobKeeper. Now, many of the people in our arts, certainly hospitality, those sorts of areas have ongoing casual jobs and have not been able to access JobKeeper. So I think there's a significant unseen group of people who will be struggling at the moment. JobKeeper, we know in New South Wales, there's around 300,000 plus people on JobKeeper at the moment. That's keeping them from being unemployed. But I think once that's withdrawn in September, many people are hoping they'll go back to jobs and back to work where there will be businesses that just won't make it through this COVID period simply because they haven't got the financial resources and they weren't able to actually sustain their businesses post JobKeeper. So very much for the union movement, it's about jobs, jobs and jobs, and how do we get people back into employment. We know after the global financial crisis, the longer that people remained unemployed, the harder it was for them to get back into employment. And I think given the downturn we're about to experience in Australia, I think that is going to be one of the very, very important things. How do we actually get people back to work? As part of that, we're all in this together right here until we're not. And obviously some of the positions taken by the employer groups, the usual blunt instrument of cutting wages, cutting conditions to generate growth. In the last couple of weeks in defeating the bill to have public sector pay rises cut, have been saying very clearly that if we want to stimulate growth in this economy, the best way to do that is to put money in the back of in people's wallets so they expend it in communities. The government talks about large construction projects. I think Adam's pointed out Ray Cooper's article in the Herald today. She also gave a lecture at Labor Council last night that these projects are problematic on two fronts. One, they don't disseminate stimulus across the state. They're simply project-based. And secondly, they are not geared to actually assisting young people and women who have been disproportionately affected by the COVID crisis. So while the stimulus packages around construction are welcomed, I know even the CFMMEU were out today saying that they would like to see it rediverted to social housing and a broader number of projects across the state that gets that money down and into those local communities. Unless that's done, I think we're going to have further entrenched lack of growth and lack of job generation. The other thing that I think is a significant policy decision that was made by this government that's going to have substantial ongoing ramifications is allowing people to draw down on their super early. Now, while I understand people's wanting to do that, if you're a young person or you're a woman, you are actually affecting long-term your ability to financially be independent in retirement. We already know women have disproportionately affected by their time out of the workforce, unable to actually amass large superannuation packages for when they leave. And we anticipate, or there's figures going around that if you're taking your $10,000 out of your super now, you'll be up to about $100,000 worse off when you actually go to retire. And that is, I think, partly because the government's ongoing and constant attacks on the superannuation industry, particularly industry funds. And while it's short term may be good, long term, I'm not sure how we're going to fund and ensure people have adequate retirement income when they actually leave the workforce. I think the other two things, Adam's already touched on one of them, the working from home. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. I think employers see that as while we enjoy flexibility around it, it is certainly a policy where there is again cost shifting onto the employee. Take law firms, for example. There's already billable hours in that. They have oversight for that. It does not matter where that work is done. You will see an ongoing shift, I think, in those industries, particularly for people working from home, where they are paying for their own electricity, their own water, their own cleaning. And so those employers only have to provide basically meeting rooms where people meet. The rest of the time it can be done off site. I note from the finance sector union, a number of banks are actually shutting local branches. The old adage, why waste a crisis? And so they're out there doing that, cutting jobs there. And so I think we need to have a real think about what does it actually mean to be working from home. Adam touched on the occupational health and safety, but also I think one of the things that's come out of this COVID crisis is mental health, the ability for people to be isolated, not interacting. How will that affect people? I know there has been some studies and suggestions that suicide rates will increase over coming years as a result of this. I think that's certainly worthy of more work and research, but I think isolation and that changing nature of work will have significant long-term effects on people. The other area I think which is going to be very interesting is the gig economy. I think this COVID crisis has actually supercharged the gig economy. I have to say many of us would not have been fed unless we had people bicycling around our suburbs delivering our meals. That's an area we've been concerned with for a long period of time. People using algorithms to shred basically industrial rights, which have been fought for many years. I don't think we've had a substantial discussion in the community about the gig economy and what rights should be allocated to that and how we actually ensure people are protected. I think the grey area in the law around independent contractors, where people are seen not to be employees, despite being trained by the company, companies providing their policies to govern those employees, the companies ensuring where people can pick up and deliver their work, they control their pay. To me, that sounds like an employee, not an independent contractor, but I think we will see a further push to expand the role of independent contractors in work. And I think that will be one of the fighting fronts around how we protect people's industrial rights, pay and conditions as we go forward. So there's sort of the main areas I wanted to touch on, Lucy. I think one of the interesting things to note is, despite the significant job losses that have gone on, anecdotally from a number of unions, certainly outside retail, hospitality, those areas, many unions have reported to me that they have been growing or at least sustaining numbers. I think people have actually started to think about what is the role of the union movement, what does my union provide me? And I think in a number of areas where unions have stepped in with employers to negotiate agreements to enable people to get through this COVID crisis, has reinvigorated what the role of a union is in a workplace. People can plainly see what their role is, particularly around advocating for improved conditions or maintaining conditions or negotiating work from home arrangements have been very, very important, and ensuring that there are securities around workers in those situations. So I think I'll just leave it there, Lucy.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks, Adam and Louise. While Daryll is collecting up some questions and keep those questions rolling in, I might just start off because to me the critical issue that I'm personally experiencing and watching relates to the tension between flexibility on the one hand and intensification on the other. The work from home, I can't speak for other professions or occupations, but I know in our world of work, the intensification, particularly through constant Zoom meetings and the impacts on health and physical well-being are just not being discussed. And so my question actually relates to the way flexibility is framed in this current situation, particularly by employers. And I found it really interesting that when the PM proposed Accord Mark II, the response from the ACCI CEO, James Pearson, was that it was time to move beyond the zero-sum us versus them pre-pandemic world and embrace agreed workplace flexibility. And the same rhetoric came from the AI group chief, Ines Willocks, who said a more flexible and productive workplace relations system can be achieved without compromising fairness. I question that, and I just wonder if you can comment on the employer's continued approach to flexibility. Really, I suppose the question is there anything new about their approach to flexibility, which has always been around numerical and temporal flexibility most? And how do you think their approach to flexibility will be able to make jobs more secure, increase wage growth and workers' share of productivity, if at all? And I open it up to
I think one of the problems our IR system has at both a state level and a Commonwealth level is there's no longer really any proper mechanism for workers to tap into and access their share of productivity gains. Once upon a time, ultimately, outside of the ability to reach agreement, workers had access to arbitration. That's pretty much gone. And so there's no longer that mechanism. If you work in a larger workforce, you're more likely to have access to a unionised workforce, and then you have access to the bargaining mechanisms which can bring certain benefits. But if you are in a smaller workplace, chances are your employer is less sophisticated, is probably not a member of any employer association, and chances are most of the people you work with are not members of a union. Indeed, there are a majority of workplaces in this country now where there is no union representation, it seems. So you've got a situation where a lot of workers simply have no access to improved pay and conditions unless there are trendsetters in their industry where their smaller employer is influenced. So I think, we have to think about engaging around what are the mechanisms we need for workers to have to be able to get their share. I mean, the data from America and Europe is that people who have jobs are working, 3 to 6 hours a week longer. I don't know what the figures are here in Australia, but just talking to people I know working in the New South Wales public sector, they're reporting working 2 or 3 hours longer per day. Like, with Zoom meetings, with an avalanche of emails, with this sort of, you talk about work intensification, but it's just the public sector of New South Wales alone seems to have gone completely bonkers with work intensification. And so all of these people are working at home, isolated, electronically connecting with people, but working longer than ever. So, a number of the people I've spoken to are having increases in their work time of 20, 30, and even 50% a week. So I don't know what's happening in the private sector, but as I said, many people are working much longer hours. So those employers are getting the benefit of a big boost in productivity. And so at what point in time and how do workers have their share? That's a conversation we need to have.
Thank you.
I think it's also a question that goes back to an age-old issue about flexibility, and that is flexibility for whom and who benefits from the flexibility, of course. And that's a really interesting issue, I think, that Adam has raised about the enhanced productivity from homework that employers have been discovering during this particular phase, which would suggest indeed that that employers, for their own benefit, would in fact want to continue that situation with their full-time employees working contracts where the hours are completely sort of unregulated in a sense because they're at home. I mean, that to me would be a sort of an economic or financial bonus, really. But in terms of this question of for whom and for what, when we hear about this this narrative about flexibility, which is accompanying the whole narrative about the new accord and so forth, it really does go to that question of what kind of flexibility different people are conceiving. And if we look at employer associations, for instance, and what they've been engaged in more recently, well, the last couple of years, in fact, is a very long-term campaign to regulate the definitions of part-time and casual work in order to regulate those workers out of certain protections and conditions. And in this, a number of employer associations have been playing a very long game. They started it a number of years ago, and they've gone through several different court variations of court cases and so forth, which ultimately led to this, the latest federal court decision, which of course is not the end of the road in the sense that it's a federal court decision. And so for employers, there's the flexibility is very much tied up with how you define the working arrangement, and which is not new in itself, but the focus on those definitions has become very strong, and I suspect that that's going to be very much a focus of what they're looking at in terms of flexibility.
Thanks, Louise. Mark?
I mean, I think one of the flexibility question is an interesting one when you think that, you know, we have a significant number of people. I think we're up to about 16% are underemployed currently. I think that's going to go higher, much higher in the coming months. I think the number of people who are in precarious or casual employment, who, you know, for some people will say, well, that's flexibility. But I mean, you look at JobKeeper when it was brought in, you're only able to get JobKeeper if you had a part-time or casual job for one of those jobs. I think what we know out there are that people are working 2, 3 casual or part-time jobs to actually make ends meet prior to when this was happening. And the precarious nature of employment in this country means that we aren't in a position where there's a financial shock to actually withstand that. There was a recent study that people, if there was an emergency in their lives, a significant number, I think it was about 20, 30%, couldn't put together $2,000 for an emergency in a week. We've basically got people living hand to mouth out there in a casualised workforce. And so this idea of flexibility is fine if you have what we call would be a traditional job, but those traditional jobs are very much disappearing. One of the things that we were toying around with late last year was proposing that there should be a ban on anyone under 100,000 working unpaid overtime. I mean, many awards and enterprise agreements say there should be a reasonable amount of overtime worked as part of your job. I mean, I think for people under 100,000, we were saying that you shouldn't have to work those sort of hours as a way of actually redistributing work to other people. It was quite ironic because people on 160, 180,000 started ringing us and asking us, what about us? We seem to be doing a lot of unpaid work as well. I think the whole way in which we think of work has significantly changed. It's not 9 to 5 or it's not a 7-day shift roster. It is those with a significant mix of casual, precarious employment where people are trying to put those hours together within a week. So for many people, this whole flexibility argument isn't that significant in those sorts of areas. And particularly in regional or rural areas, I think it's a real issue. I mean, Adam talks about the NBN, and I think he's quite right. In many of those areas, it would be very hard to work remotely, and that's a significant problem. So while the employers like to talk about flexibility, there's been a significant increase in productivity over the last 20 years. We've had wages basically flatlining. Until that's redressed and there is a share in productivity for workers, I think it's going to be a real challenge both on the flexibility front and distributing income across our community.
Thank you. And now I'm going to hand over to my partner in crime, Daryll Hull, who's going to manage the Q&As. Daryll.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you to the panellists. Curating the Q&As has been a bit of a challenge because people have got observations as well as questions, which is great. But I've noticed that the panellists, Adam, you've been able to see a couple of the questions and respond to them. Thank you for that. In an attempt to hold it together in some way, I'm going to suggest there are 2 or 3 themes in the questions. What the working from home theme we should circle back to. There are some questions there for the panellists. The university sector, in terms of the impact of the changed IR situation, has come up a few times. And there is a final set of questions about the unilateral versus a consensus change, which would probably be a nice segue into current conversations taking place in Canberra about changes to industrial relations under the new consensus. But there is a comment to be made, which I have to share. Mark, Morey, a couple of people have absolutely said how much they love the poster you're sitting in front of. I don't know, can you say something so they can see the poster, please?
It's the
No, you have to speak.
Nelson Mandela, when he toured here, it was sponsored by Labor Council. Michael Leeson was the secretary at the time. It was held in the forecourt down at the Opera House. I was still at university and I was down there and actually was at that rally. And Neil, who's our resident historian, when I took over, put that there. He always leaves that one there. He rotates different pictures around my office, sending me various messages as he curates the art in my office to keep me on the straight and narrow.
Thank you for that. I should also say, by the way, it did start to sound a bit like a revival meeting because the comments were, I was at that rally too. And then someone else came in and said, yes, I know, I saw you there. So it begins to tell you it's a bit of a revival meeting going on here. Thank you for that. Adam, I know you've answered a couple of the questions about working from home, but trying to pick the eyes out of the questions that people have been asking. The idea of employers may want to curb costs by people continuing to work from home, but there is a view that people, particularly in the public sector, will resort to traditional resistance to working from home and want to get back into the office as soon as possible. And that lines up with another couple of questions, particularly a fairly disparaging observation about the concept of workplace socials, virtual, where you sit in front of your screen with a glass of wine in order to preserve workplace teams. And another question relating to that, or an observation about the idea of job satisfaction and social connectedness and the need to work with other people, to be around other people. And finally, an observation or a question being made that the narrative about working from home being a really good place to go, but has there been much data generated on the impact of the pandemic on the mental health of workers who are going through this, before and since especially? So would anybody like to grab hold of this and tease it a bit more? And I think the 2 themes that'd be good to get your opinions on are, firstly, the push for people to go back to the office, which is driven by their desire for social connectedness, overriding the employer's desire to keep them working from home in order to save money. And I guess the question of the extent to which, if you are looking for social connectedness and people are going to be working from home, the other question was, how do employers then provide a sense of social connectedness if people actually aren't in the office anymore? You've answered some of this, but I was wondering if I could cast it back to you and get your views on maybe drilling a little deeper into this subject. Would anybody like to have a go?
Yep. Look, humans are pack animals. You know, they want to operate in groups, whether it's, you know, families, friends, or workplaces. And I think the push to get back into the office that I'm detecting from people in both the public and private sectors is it being led by workers. It's almost like having too much of a good thing. It's like workers have traditionally, I think, wanted more access to working from home so that they can better balance the different competing parts of their lives. But now they've sort of been pitched into permanently and only working from home. And so I think that is too much for most workers, and they do want access to work. Obviously, if you know people already, interacting through mediums like this or having these work socials on Zoom, that's okay. It doesn't really replace face-to-face interaction, but it's okay as an alternative. But for people who are new coming into workplaces, imagine you've just started. In fact, I had a close friend who just started a new job when this happened, and then went into lockdown and was working in isolation from everybody else he was supposed to be working with. And he just found it very difficult and very stressful, and it had a terribly negative impact on his mental health because he didn't know any of the other people. When you were having meetings like this, he wasn't able to see or pick up on all the non-verbal communication skills. He wasn't able to mediate or navigate the sort of informal communication channels in the workplace, or even get a sense of the hierarchies or the power dynamics. And he felt very, very dispossessed, and still does, and is very much champing it at the bit. So I think that's just one example of what many workers are experiencing. So many workers, I think, have found an overexposure to working from home has really sapped, I think, their enthusiasm for it, but a much more balanced working from home possibilities is still very much top of mind for many workers that I've been speaking with. Because, people, like, I live in the Blue Mountains. When I'm commuting, I'm often commuting 3 to 4 hours a day. You multiply that over a week and over a year, that's a lot of your time traveling. So people do want to get that time dividend back. So working from home 1 or 2 days a week or a fortnight or a month is great, but working from home all the time every day is not. So I think getting that balance right for workers is vitally important, because the nourishment intellectually, emotionally, that comes from being in the workplace, working collaboratively with other people, just cannot be done through mediums like this. You can have a formal meeting like this, but let's face it, most work you do isn't in a meeting. It's one-on-one or in small groups or even working by yourself. But knowing if you hit an impasse or you need to bounce an idea off someone, you can just walk around the corner or have an incidental conversation. Having to put everything in an email or having to schedule a Zoom meeting or even having just to make a phone call every time you want to have one of those incidental conversations is actually slowing down a lot of people's work and making their work harder. And it's actually leading to more intensification of work, and we're getting burnout.
Thanks, Adam. Anybody else want to have a go?
Can I just, as an academic, mention that all of the issues that you just described are sort of really intense for PhD students from overseas that are in our universities, who are totally cut off from families and now from each other and from their supervisors, except by Zoom and so on, with huge impacts. I mean, teachers across the whole gamut, whether at our level or in primary schools, are really suffering as well as their kids, the students. But I really think, I just wanted to give a shout out as a result of some sort of check-ins we've been having with our PhD students, the suffering of those that are locked down here doing isolating research work at the best of times without family. We just need to be sensitive to those people as well.
Could I take that as a segue into 2 more questions we've had, Lucy, about universities? Unless Louise or Mark, you wanted to talk about the working from home thing?
Well, if I could just add a couple of points about the working from home, because I think this is actually it's a really complex issue. And while there are all of those psychological issues about working in an isolated, remote way, there are also many advantages that people are obtaining from it. And one of those is an economic advantage of not having all those costs. Now, I mean, things like the in a city like Sydney, where people can spend $25 or up to $40 a day on the freeway costs of actually driving into work and getting home, and before you actually have the other costs of going to work. And we all know, everyone talks about the idea of sort of sitting and having Zoom meetings in your pajamas. But, but I think there are actually a range of midway experiments that are also actually being tried in a number of countries. And in America, for instance, you know, there's Harvard Business Review reports on a number of experiments where big companies have developed co-working pods in different parts of big cities, for instance, where people can go in on a, you know, 1 or 2 days a week and so forth, and they are with co-workers, but they're, you know, so there are, what I'm trying to suggest with that idea is this idea of, you know, that there are intermediary forms, and that I think there is a lot of room to experiment with those as we go into the future, because clearly many people have had a taste of not going into work 5 days a week, which is what many people wanted anyway, and they've now had a taste of it. So it is going to change preferences in that way, I would think.
Thanks, Louise. Mark?
I mean, I think there's probably two things for me. I mean, one, before we started this, there'd been a push to, particularly in the gig economy, particularly in the NDIS, there were businesses that were operating where people were carers for the NDIS whose jobs were allocated on phones. They selected those jobs on phones. They did that. They weren't seeing anyone else in a workplace. So there is this push, particularly in certain areas of the economy, for people to be just simply, particularly in the gig economy, isolated, doing work without seeing people around them. I think the thing with COVID is working from home is probably good as long as you have those other avenues, able to see your family, links through your sporting, church, social, different groups where you're interacting. What we've seen, by and large, until recently is, for many people, working from home and social isolation have been accentuated. And I think the mental health aspect of this is I think a bit of a wake-up call for us about the role of work, the role of our communities, how we link together, how we communicate. I take Adam's point about being a herd mentality. That's all right if you're not socially or economically isolated. You have a disability or other things like that, which mean that you aren't able to connect with people. And I think as much as we talk about this working from home flexibility aspect, my concern is that we are driving our community and ourselves into further isolation and not being interconnected as a community. And I think, you know, the online gig world, phones, tablets, computers, all those sorts of things, we need to have a long, hard think about, while the flexibility, there's a great upside to it. Commuting via Zoom and doing those things are very positive. I think there's a very significant effect that we need to think about, A, with mental health, but also the cohesiveness of our communities and interacting together as a community. So while I see the upside of it, I'm not convinced of it. The other downside is, I have to say, many phone calls which would have taken 10 or 15 minutes seem to have turned into an hour Zoom meeting of a day now. So that would be one thing I'd be very concerned about, is Zoom becoming Zoomaholics. Seems to be a case.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me segue off onto two questions about universities, if I may. Would any of the speakers and or hosts, I think that's Lucy, your call, like to comment on the attempts nationally and in various universities to change the rules on enterprise agreements? And that lines up with another question separately, but I think related, that the government has changed the JobKeeper regulations 3 times to ensure that universities are not eligible for the scheme. It would appear that this federal government would be happy to see a complete reshaping of the sector, with universities emerging post-COVID as smaller institutions, which would suit their neoliberal agenda. I might say the caveat at the end of that is, your thoughts, Mark? Question mark?
Yeah, I don't understand why universities were certainly cut out of JobKeeper. I think it's sort of crazy stuff. I think this is a government that continues to attack the tertiary institutions. I mean, the comment's been made consistently as they stand up and talk about the importance of research and believing research. When we talk about COVID, however, global warming, the research is not so good. So it's very much a pick and choose on those sorts of things. For me, particularly going back to the statement I made before about workers on temporary visas, I mean, our tertiary sector is our third biggest export. I think pre-COVID was our third biggest export. We were leaders in the way in which our tertiary institutions educate people here and internationally. We don't value education enough. We don't value it, whether it's primary school teachers, high school teachers or universities. And the irony of that is I think that the government saw itself as, well, we'll just cut them out of JobKeeper or JobSeeker. I mean, I think it's the same thing here in New South Wales, where they've tried to hand out a pay cut to public sector workers who have got us through the bushfires, certainly got us through COVID. They always reach for the blunt instrument, demonising those workers, saying they're not contributing to society and are not valued in the way they should be valued. And the tertiary sector, given it is our third biggest export, I would have thought they would have been treating it with kid gloves and putting it in cotton wool and looking after it for the long term.
Look, I'm not an expert in the university sector, but when I was, first of all, I noticed that while public universities are excluded from JobKeeper, I saw that they changed the regulations to enable 4 private universities to qualify. So I think, if they just made a decision to keep the tertiary education sector out, you could have a debate about that policy decision, but the partiality of saying private universities get access to it, but public universities don't, overlooks the fact that a number of these so-called public universities depend so much on private money to sustain them, not just the money they get from the government. So I think that's a big problem. The other thing I noticed the other day in discussions about the tertiary education sector, and I was truly shocked, something like 45% of staff are casual, 22% are on fixed term contracts, and the minority actually have, to any degree, secure ongoing employment. Well, that's a really, I guess, pronounced form of what we're seeing in the broader workforce, where a full 1/3 of working people have no security in Australia, according to the ABS. It's a mixture of casual and gig work and sort of fixed term contracts. Now, we have to have a real debate about secure work. People, apart from economic insecurity, creates a lot of social anxiety if your work isn't secure, if you're living from job to job, or even fixed term contract to fixed term contract, or shift to shift. That's really not acceptable. And with that, we've seen the rise in people for whom renting is their only real form of housing. Now, renting used to be for students and for people transitioning. It didn't used to be a permanent kind of housing for so many people. And so you can see this is going hand in glove with insecure work. And ultimately, that's going to undermine our egalitarianism and our sense of economic security. So I think governments have to think about how we should approach those issues in a regulatory way. I really think the time has come to have a proper discussion about this.
Thanks for that.
Just one point that I would make about the university context, and that is that it goes back to what I was saying up front in my sort of earlier points, that one of the issues I think that's occurring in a range of universities, and this has nothing whatsoever to do with the university I work in, I'd have to say completely not to do with my university, which has had quite a strong dialogue with staff. But I think because universities, like other institutions, don't have to be transparent about their financial status in making these sorts of variations to agreements, they're able to, as other organisations are, to essentially argue that they're in dire situations when they're not, and then justify making sorts of various changes for staff. And so you do actually see in different parts of Australia, you can see universities sitting alongside each other where the financial impact in one may be much heavier than the financial impact in another, but it's in the other one where they're actually saying that they're under more dire financial straits and having to make changes. So I think this issue of financial transparency, of having to open the books, is actually really important in these situations.
Thanks for that, Louise. There are two questions sort of segueing off that into the enterprise agreement world generally, one question was followed, which was a statement that the extent to which huge workplace changes have been introduced in response to COVID-19 were made unilaterally by employers rather than being negotiated with employees or unions. So is there any evidence, systematic or anecdotal, onto whether collective agreements were actually used to introduce change on behalf of the employers without negotiation? And a follow-up from that was, question goes like this: I think one of the problems has been, or at least in higher education, the silence of our agreements on many of the measures proposed. Most of our agreements don't have stand-down provisions, for example. The overused word unprecedented comes to mind. How do we address these matters in the future now that we know that the enterprise agreements that we have negotiated are either being changed, ignored, overridden or hollowed out? And this is, by the way, pre the idea of the new consensus that is being discussed in Canberra at the moment. So the panelists have a view on enterprise agreements and their use or sets of fit for purpose faced with a COVID-19 dilemma and a fairly assertive push by employers, universities included, to change the rules. Anybody?
Christian Porter himself is reported as saying of actually saying how many agreements had been changed in the first or the second week after the regulatory change. When he agreed that there would be a review at a certain point, he argued that there had been something like 9 or 10 major changes in enterprise agreements that had used that provision. That's really the only evidence at the moment that really exists, except that which particular union institutions and other organisations might actually have, which is yet to be looked at.
I mean, from my point of view, the value of an enterprise agreement or an award is your ability to actually enforce the conditions. For me, that comes down to you say it again, join your union. If you have the ability on the ground to enforce the conditions in your enterprise agreement, then I think in many workplaces where there is a strong union presence, you have the ability to negotiate the outcomes with the employer. You are not simply overridden and people don't feel like they're one out and they're going to get sacked if they put their hand up or complain about something. And this is one of the things I think employers have been very good at is separating us out, demonizing unions, people not understanding what unions are actually about. And for many of the young people in the gig economy who we've been working with, primarily those who are on the bicycles, many of them are a generation going through, don't even know what a union is. And we know as unionists, the easiest way to recruit someone to join the union is if someone in your household is or has been a union member. And so we're actually going through a whole process now of actually having to re-educate a generation or a couple of generations about what collectivism is, what collective action is, how you enforce your rights in a workplace and how that's done. And, the density and the size of unions at the moment makes it hard to always point to examples of to other people about how you educate people around that. But I think COVID has provided that opportunity. There are workplaces where they have been successful in maintaining conditions, having good conditions for COVID for those workers, as opposed to where, people are trying to cut wages and conditions. I think COVID, for me, is a great advertising campaign for the union movement. If you want to protect your rights, you want people to advocate on your behalf and be part of a collective that provides better workplace conditions, join your union. Here ends the advertisement.
I didn't hear an ad there at all. It was perfectly logical to me. I have one last question, Lucy, before I hand back to you, perhaps. It's an interesting one, came in a bit late. Many social care and support workers, disability particularly and mostly women, are not covered by enterprise agreements. Women are increasingly experiencing homelessness, are present in precarious employment, low wages and have low super balances. They're working in other people's homes. Personal protective equipment is limited. The recent building stimulus excludes many women via occupational segregation. The gendered impacts of COVID run deep. Varying enterprise agreements is less helpful in these circumstances. Should we shift the employment conversation from bargaining to prosecuting OH&S breaches? Should we shift the conversation from bargaining to prosecution? What do the panelists think?
I'm happy to go. I think you need both. I mean, I think the enterprise bargaining process has come very much to a natural conclusion. The process turned into giving away wages and conditions in terms of pay rises. I think the early Accord years where you saw superannuation, Medicare be given back as a substantial thing to working people for forgoing pay rises makes a sensible outcome. But as we've seen in recent years, productivity has increased through enterprise bargaining particularly, but those benefits have not been shared with the workforce. I think you need a strong, whether it's an enterprise agreement or whether it's an award, and I think there's some, I mean, Adam would probably agree with me, going back to an award-based system where you had the state system, had an award system, you had a federal system, and you would leapfrog one over the other to improve conditions as you went on, has some merit looking back at it now, I think substantially. But you cannot just rely on prosecutions to actually enforce rights. What you actually need is a system that provides conditions for all workers. I would suggest that we have to look at how we have minimum conditions for all workers, not just the 10 that are contained in the federal legislation, but there must be basic employment rights, minimum wage rights contained that are a floor to the industrial relations system. And then you need a system in which you build on those with employers through negotiation. And the question is very apt. I think women have been disproportionately affected during this COVID crisis. Unpaid work will be further entrenched for women particularly. Ray Cooper has written about that today, but she also spoke to us yesterday about that. I think there are significant issues for women long-term, as I mentioned, around superannuation as well. And there needs to be a way in which we look at adjusting the superannuation to take in the needs of women's inability to accumulate that during their careers at the same rate men do. And there have to be significant changes made to accrue that. Words and saying, oh, we're going to do our better to get better returns is not going to deliver that for women. There needs to be a way in which we look at parity and generating that parity over the long term for women. And that's the same in employment. Many of those industries that have continued to work throughout the COVID crisis have been female-dominated industries. Health, education, particularly disability services, caring, and it's an opportunity to reevaluate how we value those positions. And they are important work. They have been devalued because they've been seen as feminised sectors. And I think looking at COVID, they are the sectors that keep society running, can keep society together, and there needs to be a push to make sure that they are better valued and better remunerated.
Look, I agree with Mark. I think one of the big issues we've got is the, when you look at the benefits of enterprise bargaining, who has accrued those benefits most have been workers in largely, blue collar, male dominated industries, relatively high levels of union density, where you can engage the bargaining mechanisms. And because the federal bargaining mechanisms involve taking protected action, a lot of workplaces in a realistic sense don't have access to that. And particularly when you look at non-government sector, largely female dominated industries, they're not realistically in a position to take, frankly, strike action or to do other forms of industrial action. So they can't get access to the benefits that might come from bargaining. And frankly, they have less conditions to trade off in terms of greater productivity. So we do need, whether we go back to what we used to have of, mostly an award-based system, we need to have a circuit breaker where workers in their unions can approach an industrial umpire for arbitration around issues. And taking Mark's point, yes, we do need more rights included in the national employment standards. And I think we have to find ways of reconnecting the connection between hours worked and pay, because although a lot of awards still provide for overtime, there are a lot of workers who are working ever longer hours for their set wage, and they're just not getting paid extra. And that's not realistic, because in a smaller workplace where there's an intimacy, everyone knows each other, there's an embarrassment about asking for money and about asking for pay increases. And if you're working longer and longer hours, there should be more leave for those people. There was a really good article 5 years ago by the economics writer Jessica Irvine, who said, look, all Australian workers should now get 5 weeks leave. And she just did a simple metric. If you spend 10 minutes every day after work looking at your work emails, that's at least an extra week of leave a year you should accrue. Now, you think about how much more all the workers you know in your life do outside of work hours and outside of the workplace. It's not just simply reading a few emails for 10 minutes. It's reading for 20, 30 minutes, writing replies, sometimes well into the night. And again, maybe as part of the return on productivity gains, workers need to have access to more paid leave for their extended working hours if they're not going to be paid overtime payments. So we need to, have this connection between hours worked and pay or leave. And I think that's a conversation we need to have in the industrial system.
Thank you.
So, Louise?
One final point there, though, about prosecution, and that is that the very workers that we're talking about here, as Mark and Adam have alluded to, really, are the people who would find it the most difficult of anyone in the workforce to actually secure an individual prosecution. The pathway to getting a prosecution against, as we've seen with the wage underpayment issue, and how problematic that has been, and how the Fair Work Ombudsman has been able to sort of move into that area and make a huge headway, but at significant cost. And we know that the resources for these organisations, unless the resources are actually dramatically improved, organisations like the Ombudsman can't sort of seek to do this in every area, because that would thin out the resources going to any one of those areas. So unless you've got an organisation like that pursuing a prosecution, it's extremely difficult for individuals, as we know. I mean, and discrimination law, of course, is the area of law that taught us that individual prosecutions are extremely difficult and harrowing to pursue. So I think we need to find broader solutions than that.
Yep,
Right.
couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much for that. And I'll now hand back to Lucy to wrap it up. Lucy, over to you.
Thank you. Just trying to get the right slide up to say thank you so much to all our speakers for their time and their knowledge, sharing their knowledge and their views. I'd also like to particularly thank our admin and professional support, Billy Bruce and Pabs Delgado Hernandez, who are providing us with the technical side of things. Also Jason Anthony and Lynn Cousins from the Centre for Workforce Futures for their work on the flyers and the invitations and registrations. And finally, we would really like to thank you, the audience, for participating in what was a well-rounded discussion. It's really important, and we at the Centre for Workforce Futures think it's very, very important for us to be engaging in dialogue with people on the front lines and in industry and the labour movement. We wanted to bring together today also the industrial and the political wings of the labour movement in integrated discussion, because both are very significant in dealing with the current situation. We apologise if we didn't get to all of the questions, including the one about the open plan office. Let's hope it is dead. And hopefully we'll get to that question as a separate event. we will be releasing the recording of the session to everybody that registered, and hope that you can use it for whatever teaching, research, discussion in your workplaces and so on. And we also finally invite you to support one of our projects at the moment, which is a collaboration, international collaboration being led out of Montreal University, including us at Macquarie, Toulouse Business School, Brunel in the UK, Laval in Quebec, and Bucknell in the USA. There are 12,000 responses to it internationally already, and we hope that we will be able to get enough participants in Australia to enable really good benchmarking and comparisons. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, partner in crime, Daryll Hull, for managing the questions so effectively. Thank you again to our speakers, Louise Thornthwaite, Adam Searle, Mark Morey, and thank you everybody for coming, and I hope you can attend our next one in the not so distant future. Thanks again. Bye.